In this video, we'll see how the debugger built into IntelliJ and Pycharm can help us to understand what our code's doing. We've seen how to run the code by right-clicking in the editor pane, like so, and selecting Run, but just below that there's this debug option. Now just before I click that, I want to talk about an option that might come up on the screen like you'll see here for Windows users. So if you see this dialog and you're on Windows, either now or at some other point when using your IDE, then it's very important that you tick the box to allow access on private networks, as you can see checked on the screen. Make sure that's checked and then click on Allow Access. Failing to do that, you'll find that basically IntelliJ or your IDE, whatever you're using, won't be able to access the internet. Now on a Mac, although I haven't got a screenshot for this, you may notice there's a little message that can appear down the bottom right hand corner suggesting you install a Python extension. Now if you're using a different implementation of Python other than what we've suggested you install in this course, you won't see that, but with the CPython implementation on a Mac you should see it pop up at some point, but I suggest you ignore it, and if you do that the dialog will disappear after a short while. Now this particular extension on a Mac, it can be really useful if you've got a large code base, but at the moment the code in this course isn't complex enough to benefit from installing another extension. It's really just introducing another potential point of failure, so for that reason I suggest you ignore it. Right, so back to the screen now. I'm going to click on Debug instead of Run. Now you can see what's happened there. We've got some text showing PyDev Debugger process 4672 is connecting. It may well say connected instead of connecting. Now ignore the process ID, that number will probably be different for you, and in fact will be different every time you're running it. Now notice that we've got a debug pane at the bottom of the screen rather than a run pane, and that will come up when we're actually using this debugger. Now the debugger itself has got two panes. We've got the debugger and the console, and you can see at the moment the console pane is checked, and that just shows the output from your program, just like it did when we were running programs previously. It's basically the same output if you're running it using the Run option. And we'll see the Debugger tab in a moment. But what I'm going to do now is just enter my details. Down here I'm going to type in my name and an age. And you can see the program runs just as it did before in the previous video. But where the debugger gets interesting is when we set breakpoints in our code. A breakpoint tells the debugger to pause at that point. This allows us to see what the code's doing and step through line by line. The good news is that setting a breakpoint's easy. All you need to do is just click in the left margin on the line you want to set the breakpoint at. So I'm going to set one over here on line 11, clicking in the margin there. And you can see when I did that, the line's highlighted and we've got now a red dot in the left margin. To clear a breakpoint, click it again. And you can toggle breakpoints on and off throughout your code. I'm going to set that one back on line 11. Now that I've done that, when I use the debug option again, the code will stop when it reaches that breakpoint. Now to get there, because we're executing the code at the moment above that, we're executing the code at the moment on line 1, so we need to enter some information until the code gets to that point. So I'm going to type in Tim and 30. And you can see what happened when I pressed 30 there. The program's now got up to line 11 and it's waiting there for us to do something. Now in the Debugger tab of the debug pane, you can see the value of our two variables there on the right hand side. Now the Debugger tab normally opens automatically, as you saw that it did here in my case, but you can switch between the Debugger and the console tabs by clicking them. So I come over here and click on console and there's the output. I'll go back to Debugger for now. So looking at the left hand pane in the Debugger tab, it can look a tad confusing. The good news is we can ignore all of that at the moment. Just make sure that you've got the top option, blocks, selected, and you can see at the top that it is selected for me. Now to the right of the console tab, note that we've got a mini toolbar with a few buttons. The first one, the three horizontal bars that represent lines of code, shows the current line that will be executed. Now where that is useful is in larger programs or programs using several files. We've only got a few lines of code, but we can demonstrate what it does. And I can do that by going back up to line 1, say to there. If our current execution line was off the screen, say, this button's a quick way to get back to it. So when I come down here and click on that button, you can see the cursor split down to line 11. Not particularly useful in a small file, but very much useful if you've got larger files or multiple files that you're working on. Now I'm going to talk about the last button next, this one over here. It's the last one that's available anyway. And you can see that it looks a little bit like a calculator, and it lets you evaluate expressions. Now our code is about to execute line 11 and hasn't executed it yet. I'm just going to move that code down so you can see a bit more of it, and then I'm going to click on that little button, Evaluate Expressions. Now I'm going to move this over to the right so we can still see the code and see this at the same time. And under expression I'm going to type age less than 18. I come down here, click on Evaluate, and when I do that, note that we've got result equals, and in left to right curly braces, bool being the type, and then the value, in this case, false. So looking at our code, we can see now that given that age less than 18 is false, that line 12 won't be executed. That's because the expression on line 11 is going to evaluate to false. I suggest you do this when using the debugger as a learning tool. Don't just click the next button and watch the code executing. Take the time to read the code and work out what it's going to do. When you think you've worked it out, then you can step through the code to see if you're right. Great way to really solidify the information you're learning in this course. Now, if you just mindlessly click the button to run the next line, which I'll talk about shortly, you won't really learn very much. You'll learn how to mindlessly click a button, but we're learning to become programmers here, not mindless button clickers. Alright, so moving forward, we know that line 12 won't be executed. Next comes line 13. So that's going to test the condition age is equal to the value of 900. Now we really don't need the expression evaluated to work that one out, because we can clearly see age in the debugger variables pane there at the bottom of the screen showing the value of 30. But we're seeing how to use it, so I'm going to enter the expression anyway. Age equals 900. Note also, if I type a variable name that doesn't exist, we'll actually get an error. So it's a good way to confirm that what you're typing is valid. So age is equal to 900. I was typing 1800 instead of 900. Same tool there. I can click on Evaluate. And you can see the result down the bottom again is showing false. And just to confirm that I could change this, result is equal to 30. Evaluate. You can see the value there is true. So I can see how this is a very useful tool, but I'll set it back to 900. Click on Evaluate. We get false again. Basically, that's telling us also that the code on line 14 won't be executed either. Alright, so there's no other conditions in our short little program to check, and none of the ones we've checked were true. So the only really thing left now is the else block. So that's what's ultimately going to be executed on line 16. So let's see if we're right. I'm going to firstly close the Evaluate pop-up. Let's have a look at some of these other buttons here to the right of that this little button here that we've already talked about, the show execution point. The two buttons we're going to look at the moment are this one here, which is the step over and step into. We're not really going to look at this other one, step into my code at this point. Specifically, it's these first two which appear to do the same thing. And we'll actually look at step into when we actually start writing our own functions. For now though, I'm going to come over here and click on step over, noting that we've got a shortcut key we could use instead of clicking if we prefer. So I'm going to click that once. Notice when I do that, the code on screen has jumped to line 13. So line 12 didn't get executed as we expected, and we're at the elif statement on line 13. I'm going to click the button again and see what happens with this expression. And you can see also we were right again. In this case, line 14 wasn't executed. Instead, we've skipped straight down to the else code on line 16. Basically, we knew that both of those expressions evaluated to false, and we've got confirmation of that by clicking on the step over button. Now we can also confirm that nothing's been output by clicking over here to the console tab. So I'll do that now. And notice we've got the two bits of information that I typed in, but we've got no other output at this time. But if I click on step over one more time now, you can see that caused line 16 to execute. We've got the message "you're old enough to vote" printed in the console. Clicking it one more time will execute the last line and then end the program. And you can see that's what's happened. We've got the message, put an X in the box, and the program terminates. Alright, so that's the debugger. Now we're going to be using the debugger a lot in the early sections. I don't recommend using one for real debugging unless you're totally stuck, but they're a great way to watch your code executing while you're learning about it. Experiment with setting breakpoints and stepping through your code to get used to using the debugger. Now before I finish, there's another button I want to show you. It's very useful if you do get stuck, if you step too far for example, or end up debugging the Python libraries. So I'm going to run the program in the debugger one more time. So notice the red square over to the left-hand side of the screen down the bottom. That's used to stop execution, allowing you to start again if you get caught or get into a mess. You might get some errors when you stop the program, but I'm going to click on that now. Now I've only got a note there saying the process finished with exit code -1, but if you do get some errors when you stop the program, that's fine. Ignore any errors in that scenario. That's completely okay when you're terminating the program, as we've done there by stopping it. So with that said, I'm going to finish now, and in the next video what we're going to do is start taking a look at more on if, elif and else. See you in the next video.